Gestalt Principles of Musical Organization. As described by such scholars as Wertheimer, Kohler, and Kafka, Gestalt psychology primarily deals with the cognitive organization of one's perception of the world. The term Gestalt means whole, and thus a main concern was for the overall structure or total viewpoint of a given situation. This is aptly summarized in the statement, "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts," which indicates that analyzing an experience for its constituent parts will not necessarily lead to a complete understanding. Other key concepts include figure-ground relationships and the law of pregnans with its corollaries. Figure-ground relationships result from an awareness that as we perceive a given situation, certain aspects stand out as more important than others. In familiar situations, individuals with common experiences tend to perceive figure-ground relationships in a similar fashion. The possibility exists, however, for different individuals to perceive the same experience in different ways. Sometimes, an object becomes the figure simply because it's larger or closer than objects in the background, like the closest statue in this picture. This is a classic example of a figure-ground relationship. Notice that you can interpret the image as a white vase, the figure, against a black background. Alternatively, you can perceive two silhouetted faces in black as the figure against a white background. This is an illustration of how the mind can exert some degree of control over the perceptual organization of the environment. As you view this picture, force yourself to consider the flowers in the foreground as the primary element, that is, the figure, of this scene. All other objects will recede into the background. Now, shift your attention so that the Capitol building becomes the figure. You can also shift to make the flag or the statue at the top become the figure. Listen to this brief excerpt and notice that the left-hand accompaniment immediately fades into the background, becoming the ground, as the right-hand melody becomes the figure. Listen to it a second time, and this time imagine that you're a piano teacher. You're working on the student's left-hand technique. Can you focus your attention on the left hand, ignoring the right hand so that it becomes the figure? The fact that you can switch back and forth, making the left or the right hand the figure, illustrates the way the mind can exert control over perceptions. Here's another example, this time from a Mozart sonata. As before, the melody in the right hand is normally the figure, with the accompaniment in the left hand the ground. See if you can switch your attention back and forth by concentrating on one voice or the other, alternatively making the melody the figure and then the ground. Principles that govern perceptual organization are found in the law of pregnans, which states that psychological organization will be as good as prevailing conditions allow. A paraphrase of this idea is that individuals tend to organize their perceptual environment in a predictable manner based on past experiences. The corollaries of this law clarify the phrase "in a predictable manner." They include the laws of proximity, similarity, common direction, good continuation, and closure. These corollaries help to explain how the figure is extracted from the ground, both in images and in music. The law of proximity states that sensory stimuli grouped together are more likely to be perceived as a unit than those that are separated. For example, you're most apt to describe this visual example as consisting of 5 sets of 3 lines each because of the proximity of the lines. This visual example has a parallel in the musical example. Here's the notation for the famous theme from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The stepwise motion, each pitch moving to a nearby neighbor, demonstrates the law of proximity. Below it is an octave scrambled version of the same melody that demonstrates how the lack of proximity makes it difficult to perceive the melody. Listen to these 3 examples and notice how the law of proximity prevails. Melodic movement is prevailingly stepwise. The proximity of pitches contributes to a feeling of coherence or unity. The law of similarity states that those sensory stimuli that are similar in nature are most likely to be perceived as a unit. These coins, present a familiar example of grouping by similarity: 2 quarters, 3 dimes, 1 nickel, and 4 pennies. Similarity is found in color, size, and markings. These pool balls are most likely to be grouped as 3 eighths and 2 threes. This is a simple musical example of the visual illustration of similarity. In this example, notice how the voices echo each other with similar musical and textual motives. When the soprano voice enters, it provides a strong contrast. Listen to this example and notice the repetition, that is, similarity, of musical ideas in the piano introduction. Then, notice that when the cello enters, it not only echoes previous ideas from the introduction, but that the cello and piano exchange similar motives. The law of common direction states that stimuli that continue in the direction established by preceding stimuli are more readily perceived as belonging to a unit. In this photograph, the fish can be perceived as belonging to groups, in part by the common direction of their apparent motion. Similarity, in terms of color, shape, and size, also aids in the grouping. In this musical example, you can hear contrary motion. The upper and lower voices are perceived as units, in part on the common direction of pitch movement. This passage, from a Beethoven piano sonata, demonstrates common direction. Notice how the two hands move in opposite directions, each keeping its common direction. Here's the same principle illustrated by a passage from the third movement of the same sonata. The law of good continuation says that objects are grouped together that continue in an established direction, that is, a straight line or a smoothly flowing curve. In this visual example, you're likely to perceive a straight line and a curved line because, interpreted this way, each series of dots continues in an expected manner. As the water in this photograph flows from top to bottom, its path is broken in places by trees and by people who are in the foreground. But we don't perceive isolated pools of water. Rather, we interpret the image as a continuous flow of a single stream located behind the trees. In this picture, we don't see the telephone line actually connected to a telephone. However, as a result of past experience and the principle of good continuation, we have little doubt that the cord does, in fact, connect to a telephone. This is a simple musical example of the visual representation of good continuation. This excerpt was used previously as a demonstration of proximity. However, as you listen to it again, focus on the repeated notes in the piano accompaniment and smoothly flowing lines in the voice as a demonstration of good continuation. This passage is similar to the previous voice example in that the piano and cello have distinctly moving lines. The law of closure causes us to perceive objects that are actually incomplete or unfinished when considered from a physical frame of reference as whole or complete from a perceptual frame of reference. This is a classic example of closure. The mind tends to perceive this as a circle, even though there's a visible gap at the top. Even though we can't see the road continue all the way through this picture, the mind perceives that it is continuous. The incomplete scale is much like the unfinished circle. The mind prefers the completion. In the Ballantine excerpt, the final cadence is lingered over. while in the Stussy example, it's more abrupt. Both approaches are successful in providing a sense of finality or closure. Mozart leads the listener directly to the final cadence, while Beethoven hints, particularly through the use of silence, at other possibilities. Both excerpts lead to ultimate psychological closure. Although these Gestalt laws and principles have been presented separately, common perceptions of everyday experiences usually involve multiple organizational principles overlapping each other. Thus, the way we organize musical experiences results from the proximity of tones, the similarity of timbres or rhythm patterns, the common direction established by melodic lines, and so on.